Well, good evening, everyone. My name's John Highbush. I have the honor of being the executive director of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation. I want to welcome all of you and thank you for coming out this evening. In honor of our men and women who defend our freedom around the world, if you'd please stand and join me for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thanks. Please be seated. Well, this is a big night for me because it's not often that I get to introduce and interview one of our nation's foremost visionaries in American business. I know that many of you who come to the Reagan Library often are privileged to hear from political voices. And while it's politicians that often speak here, there's no doubt that President Reagan recognized that the country's top entrepreneurs and job creators should have a voice here at his library as well. He knew them to be the geniuses that keep America competitive and innovative, and in many sectors of the economy, still very much the envy of the world. Some of those business leaders that have come before Steve and have made their mark in industry and shared their experiences with us here at the library are Jeff Immelt, Chair and CEO of GE. He's on our board of trustees. Steve Forbes, one of the world's premier publishers. Steve's also on our board. Wes Bush, Chairman, Northrop Grumman. Marilyn Houston, Chairman, Lockheed Martin. Gwynne Shotwell, President, COO of SpaceX. The list goes on. But tonight, we're fortunate to have with us a man who quite literally has worked to reshape our world. Someone who has influenced how all of us live, work, and play. And I'm speaking, of course, of the co-founder of America Online, Steve Case. Steve, we want to welcome you to the Reagan Library. In the 1990s, Steve built and grew AOL into the top performing company in the United States. At its peak, more than half of all consumer internet traffic in the United States ran through AOL. Then later on, when Steve engineered AOL's merger with Time Warner, he became for a while the chairman of the biggest media and communications empire in the world. Now, I think one of the most unique things about Steve, our guest tonight, is that his interests extend far beyond his own entrepreneurship. Steve has spent a good deal of time in his life helping other entrepreneurs make it as well. Whether it's been as an important voice for industry to government or as a generous philanthropist bridging the digital divide with his wife, Jean, Steve has been at the forefront of thought leadership since the dawn of the digital age to the present day. So with that, I'd like you, ladies and gentlemen, to please join me in a conversation with Mr. Steve Case. Good to see you.
Thank you, John, and thank you all for coming tonight. It should be fun.
Well, I was telling Steve, I think before that you could do one of two things. You could stand up and give a 30-minute speech in which you could bore the audience to death.
or you could answer questions for 30 minutes and bore the audience to death.
Yeah. Or I could help you bore the audience to death for 30 minutes. But let me say, after I'll have my way with Steve, ask questions. But we're going to try and leave 25, 30 minutes for questions from you all. And the only thing we ask is that if you have a question, raise your hand, but wait until the microphone gets put in your hand by one of our staffers, because we want to hear your voice because you're on film and we're broadcasting this live on the web. So that would be greatly appreciated. Steve, tell us how you went from Pizza Hut to running America Online.
All right. Well, first of all, it's great to be here. Obviously, a great respect for President Reagan, brought the country together, and for John, who I worked with about 15 years ago, I think, on a project including this idea of bridging the digital divide. So it's great to be here. And again, thank you all for coming. Answer the question. A little bit of a backstory. When I was in college in the late 70s, and particularly when I was a senior, I read a book, some of you may recall, by Alvin Toffler, called The Third Wave. So you might know some similarities here. And I was a senior at the time I read the book, and I was completely mesmerized by it. And that really set a path for my future. He talked essentially about what we now think of as the internet, sort of an electronic cottage, even though back in 1980 it was completely futuristic. But when I graduated, there was no internet company to go to because it didn't yet exist. And there was frankly not a startup culture back in 1980. So I went to work initially for Procter & Gamble, a big, very successful company in Cincinnati, and then after a couple of years moved to Pizza Hut, which at the time was owned by PepsiCo, and I had what's still to this day my best title, Director of New Pizza Development. That was me. And yes, the company paid me to travel around the country and eat pizza. This is not a bad gig if you're, I think I was 23 at the time. Did that for about a year, and then finally found my way into what we now think of as the online world. I moved in 1983 to Washington, D.C. to join a startup, which sadly promptly failed. But two of the people I met there, and I then started AOL in 1985, so 31 years ago, when only 3% of people were online, and those 3% were only online 1 hour a week. So it was early days, and we said we wanted to get America online. We were going to get the world online, and we were serious. And it took us really a decade before we finally got traction. Hopefully some of you were AOL customers. I'm sure you all were recipients of our AOL free trial discs, which we were not shy about sending out. So that really was a great journey. And the way I frame, again, borrowing from Toffler, his three waves were the agriculture revolution, the industrial revolution, and the technology revolution. That's sort of the arc of the last two centuries. And I remind people, particularly in Washington where I live, that it's worth remembering that, and certainly President Reagan would say this, that 250 years ago, America itself was a startup. It was just an idea. And it went from this little startup nation to the leader of the free world, in large part because it had the leading economy because of the work of entrepreneurs and innovators in the agricultural revolution, then the industrial revolution, then the technology revolution. That's part of the American story. I kind of focused on the internet specifically, and the first wave of the internet was really building the infrastructure and getting people connected. And so it was the software and the networks and the servers and all kinds of things that happened at sort of mid-1980s to 2000 or so, when it went from essentially nobody connected and frankly nobody caring about it to everybody connected and realizing it was pretty important. That was the first wave, and then the last 15 years or so has been the second wave, which is building apps and services on top of the internet, whether it be Facebook or Twitter or Waze or Snapchat. It's really been about apps, really been about software. And the third wave, the way I'm framing it in the book, is really then integrating the internet in seamless and pervasive ways in other aspects of our lives: healthcare, education, food, energy, transportation. Pretty important parts of our lives, pretty big sectors of the economy that have changed a little bit in the first wave and the second wave, but not that much, but I think are going to change a lot in the third wave. And that was why I finally decided to put pen to paper and write a book. It's my first book. I waited 57 years to write it. And the insight that led me to was the third wave would be different than the second wave, but have some similarities to the first wave. So writing a book that's essentially a book about the future also allowed me to tell some stories about the past that hopefully will inform the innovators who want to really lead the way in this third wave.
On the third wave, Steve, and you talk about using the internet and all this connectivity to try to take some of these mature sectors of the economy, whether it be healthcare or education or agriculture, what have you, and try to drive their greatest advantages and maybe new paradigms in this third wave. But would you envision this would also be the most difficult task of each of the waves, given the regulatory environment and all the things that make those industries as stolid as they might be?
Yeah, no, I think it's going to be tough, and I think it's going to require a different kind of innovator, not just entrepreneurs, also kind of innovators in larger companies to kind of bring the right perspective. And I talk about in the book what I think are the 3 Ps that are going to really define this this third wave. One is partnership. In these sectors, you can't go it alone. You need to partner with other organizations. It's not just about the app, not just about the software. There's an African proverb I love that I mentioned in the book, which is you want to go quickly, you can go alone, but if you want to go far, you must go together. I think that partnership is going to be really, really important in the third wave, and I'll talk in a minute about why. The second is policy, and the reality is sectors like healthcare, like food, like energy, like transportation are regulated, and they're going to be continued to regulate. We can debate the regulations. In some cases, they should change. In some cases, they should change a lot. But there's going to be some regulations about food safety or drug safety or making sure autonomous driverless cars on roads don't create havoc or drones in the sky don't create problems. There's just going to be some regulation. So the innovators will need to understand that and figure out a way to manage through that. And the third P is perseverance. It's going to require taking a longer-term view. Revolutionizing healthcare is not going to happen quickly. It's sometimes I learned this with AOL. Revolutions sometimes happen in evolutionary ways, and so having that patience and kind of persevering, I think, is going to be important. So those 3 Ps, partnership, policy, and perseverance, I think are going to be very important in the third wave. Actually, weren't that important in the second wave. Facebook or Snapchat or Instagram or some of the other successful apps in the second wave, it didn't require partnerships. They were able to do it on their own. Didn't really require engaging on policy. There were no regulations to deal with regarding kind of a photo app or things like that. And frankly, it didn't require perseverance because there were some actual true overnight successes that went from kind of this dorm room startup to being pretty significant companies virtually overnight. But those 3 Ps, important in the third wave, not important in the second wave, were essential in the first wave. AOL and other companies would not have been successful without partners. We actually had hundreds of partnerships. PC manufacturers, modem manufacturers, communications companies, media companies, hundreds of partnerships. We had to deal with policy. The reality was initially when we started our company, it was illegal to connect consumers or businesses to the internet. At the time in the 1980s, the internet was limited by law to non-commercial use. If you were working in government, you could use the internet. If you're working in an educational institution, a university, you could use the internet. If you're a consumer, you couldn't. If you're a business, you couldn't. We had to get that changed in the Telecom Act. It required a judicial decision. Judge Green in the early 1980s broke up Ma Bell, broke it into regional Bell operating companies, and that unleashed a torrent of innovation. So partnerships were essential and policy was essential, and it required, as I said before, a decade of working at it before we finally kind of broke through. So that to me was the key thing that led to this book, that playbook, the mindset that drove the first wave of the internet is going to be needed again in this third wave of the internet.
In fact, in the second wave, you get this picture of the kid in the college dorm in a hoodie, and 3 days later they invented Facebook and they're billionaires and all the rest. So the profile being those who are kind of young and have the ability and the interest in being essentially disruptors or disaggregators. Right. They don't know the first thing about automobile service, but they can figure out a way to create an app that might check this to connect to this and all that, right? But now in the third wave, you described the type of people that are more likely to be involved successfully in making the third wave work, and it's not the profile of the hooded 21-year-old or college dropout. Who does it actually involve?
No, it's not to say that there's still opportunities for any entrepreneur to build all kinds of different businesses, and certainly there's opportunities for the people on college campuses in their dorms to create new things, and some of them I'm sure will be great. But my argument is, if you're going to fundamentally change such important aspects of our lives, like how we think about healthcare or how our kids learn in classrooms, and you can kind of, transportation systems, particularly smart cities and things like that, it's going to require a different mindset. I think it's require a different playbook. And my guess is, on average, the leading entrepreneurs and innovators in the third wave probably will be a little older and maybe a little wiser, because having the ability to be respected, not just in terms of your coding capabilities to create that software, create that app, but being able to have the people skills to build relationships, to enable partnerships to happen, seems like it's going to be more important. And the skill set, even though particularly entrepreneurs are frustrated by government. Ronald Reagan was frustrated by a lot of aspects of government. The reality is, if these sectors are regulated, you're going to have to figure out some way to engage in a constructive fashion, and it's going to require sort of kind of a little bit of a give and take. So I think in this third wave, coding skills, engineering skills will still be important, but I think there are other skills that will also be important. Essentially, communication skills, people skills will become more important. And I think creativity is also a skill that will become more important. This imagining different possibilities in terms of how do we, and just using some of these aspects. I know when I talked to folks, this book came out about 3 weeks ago, so I've talked about it in a variety of different forums. People say, well, it seems like the world has changed so dramatically in the last couple decades, including because of the internet. I don't quite understand what you're saying about that it hasn't. Some of the most important aspects of our lives haven't changed that much. And my response to that would be, yes, we've changed how you take pictures, and yes, we've changed how you get food delivered from restaurants, or make your restaurant reservations, and a whole host of other things. But for most people, in most parts of the country, when they go to the doctor or go to the hospital, it actually works about the same as it did 10 years ago, in some cases 20 years ago. And for most people, if they go to their kid's school, pick a fourth grade school, the way the teachers teach and the way the kids learn is about the same as it was 10 or 20 years ago. In this, so we actually haven't made that much progress in terms of some of the most fundamental aspects of our lives. I think that is the opportunity in the third wave. I think there are ways, for example, in schools. Yes, there'll be some learning. There already is in apps, on software, on the internet, Khan Academy, and there are many other examples of doing terrific things. But I also think taking that technology and integrating it in what happens in actual classrooms with actual teachers, or on university campuses with actual professors, is really important. And that's the part of it that hasn't gotten as much focus, but it will require this different mindset. It will be harder, therefore perseverance. You can't go it alone. You got to figure out some way to partner. And in many cases, you got to figure out a way to navigate this kind of policy side of things. So I think there are huge opportunities there, both to create great companies that could be the next iconic companies that people think of kind of representing the best of America. But it also will require changing some of the fundamental aspects of our lives in ways that hopefully will help the lives of tens of millions of people, maybe hundreds of millions of people.
Is there a particular sector, you having studied this in this third wave, that you think is particularly ripe for this kind of transformation? Does it happen to be education or healthcare? Is there some one out there where you could see it's just ideal for the third wave?
Well, I think the most visible one we talked a little bit about probably is healthcare, because it is a pretty important aspect of our lives in terms of staying healthy or getting well when we're sick. It's 1/6 of the economy, so it's a pretty big industry. And there are different sectors, as we all know, that some of it is kind of staying healthy, what some people call the wellness sector, and there's been some innovation there, particularly in the last decade, wearable devices like Fitbit and so forth. But there's a lot more coming. More innovation beginning to happen in managing chronic diseases, diabetes, heart disease, things like that, in pretty interesting ways, and also more focus on with more life-threatening diseases around really more precision medicine, using better diagnostics, better data genomics, other things to really understand more specifically what the problem is and more specifically what the potential helpful intervention is. If you talk to MD Anderson, for example, which is one of the best cancer centers in the country, when people go to MD Anderson for a second opinion, 25% of the time they reverse the first opinion. 25% of the time, because they didn't have the right assessment, they didn't have the right data. That's an area which can be improved in the third wave with a more of what is called precision medicine. So that is one example, because it's a pretty important aspect of our lives. As I said, pretty big sector, but there are many other aspects of our lives, many other industries that I think are ripe. Financial services, there have been some things that have changed in the first and second wave. You can do things like buy stocks online, things like that. But there's a torrent of innovation now happening with startups and what's called fintech, financial technologies. Really, literally thousands of companies are targeting different segments of financial services and creating more interesting, better ways for people to essentially interact with the financial system. There's also a lot of innovation now in food systems, a lot of innovation in transportation, a lot of innovation in energy, a lot of innovation in education. So I think there are big opportunities, but it's going to require this different mindset and different playbook.
You've been involved in the past in something called the Millennial Impact Project. Could you talk to us about that?
Well, one of the things that, as you know, my wife Jean runs the Case Foundation. We have a number of different initiatives there, and one is a big focus on millennials. We really think that there's a mindset there and a skill set that really is interesting to watch and can really be transformative over the next 10 or 20 years. One area in particular. So we do a number of things. We're hosting the largest millennial conference in the country. Tens of thousands of people will participate, gathering people together and really challenging them to challenge each other to think about kind of the world in different kinds of ways. And one area in particular that we're quite intrigued by is this notion, which is driven largely by younger people, around impact investing, which is basically companies not just focused on profit, but also focused on purpose, also focused on measuring their impact. And there's something that was created about 5 years ago called the Benefit Corporation, or B Corp. Everybody in business knows about S Corps and C Corps. Now there's this thing called B Corps, where they build into the charter focus on impact. That's being driven largely by younger people who say, of course companies need to focus on profit. Of course that's the way to create a return for investors. Of course that's the way to create sustainability for the business. But we also want to have the companies we do business with or work for or invest in have a broader purpose. And so this notion of impact investing is getting significant momentum, and even some laws have been changed recently to facilitate more investment in that sector. But it's driven largely by young people.
You are running something now called Revolution. Can you just bring us up to speed on that?
Yeah, when we started AOL 31 years ago, I started as the relatively young guy. I was still in my mid-20s, and then after a little while became CEO of the company and ran it for most of the 90s. And then when we merged with Time Warner in 2000, I stepped aside as CEO, and then was chairman for a couple of years, and then started making investments. So for more than a decade, I've made investments in a variety of different sectors, and now we have a team at Revolution, both a venture capital group investing in startups and a growth capital group investing what we call speed-ups, with a particular focus on this third wave, and also a particular focus on what I call in the book the rise of the rest. That I know I say this with being careful, because I'm sitting in California, And last year, about half of all venture capital in the country went to California. 75% went to California, New York, and Massachusetts. And so this last wave, it basically, if you haven't been in California, New York, or Massachusetts, you've been disadvantaged. And we believe in this next decade, there's already good evidence of it. Some of the great innovations are going to be happening all across the country, in part because some of the big partners are in other parts of the country. Most of the Fortune 500 companies actually aren't on the coast, they're in the middle of the country. And as partnerships become more important, that's going to fuel this rise of the rest phenomenon. And just a couple examples to demonstrate what's happening here. One of the most successful food companies in the last decade is Chipotle. They're in Denver. Most successful athletic wear companies, also doing a lot of things around health tech. Under Armour, they're in Baltimore. Maryland, there's 3 multi-billion-dollar enterprise software companies all on one street in Provo, Utah. One of the most successful, or hottest, I should say, it's still early, virtual reality companies. They've raised over $1 billion of venture capital, including from Google. You know where they're located? Fort Lauderdale, Florida. So we're starting to see this regional entrepreneurship phenomenon, this rise of the rest, and that's a big focus of what we're trying to do at Revolution.
Great. Let's go to the audience now. If you have a question, politely raise your hand. I see one is up here. And we'll start with a question here, and then we'll come over here.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be here. Followed your career, so it's really an honor to meet you. There's been a surge in generosity. I think it might be because of all the billionaires made in technology, multiple reasons. I was wondering what your thoughts are on this new giving pledge with the billionaires leaving their wealth.
Well, we're supporters. We're one of the early signees of it, when it first got started. For those who don't know, it's something that started now probably 5 or 6 years ago with Bill and Melinda Gates and Warren Buffett coming together and saying, they should essentially challenge people who have been lucky enough to have had significant success to commit to give away a majority of their wealth, and that's what's called the Giving Pledge. So we've been part of that for 5 years or so, and we did it in part because we thought we were planning to give away the majority anyway. We just philosophically think that's the right thing, but by announcing a public commitment to it, it might inspire others to join, and it went from a couple dozen now to I think it's 150 people or so that are part of this. But most importantly, it would create a environment, a little bit of a network where people could learn from each other. Because actually being smart about philanthropy, as John knows, because he was very involved in this for a number of years, is actually hard. And rather than everybody do it completely on their own and sometimes make the same mistakes, maybe they can learn from each other and at least have the benefit of some of those lessons. So we do have one big annual conference that's actually coming up soon and not too far from here, where people come together and there are different discussions of different topics. So I think it's an important thing. The other thing that we've done at the Case Foundation, we don't want to just suggest that people of a certain kind of amount of wealth should be focused on this. We've done a number of things to essentially democratize philanthropy and invested in a number of platforms that we put a few $1 million into, and so far they've generated a couple $2 billion of money to a whole host of causes. So it's just as important, maybe even more important, for everybody to have ways to support at whatever level they can, whatever causes they care about. But that's why we got involved in the Giving Pledge.
Right here in the front.
Hi, Steve. Thank you for coming. And I haven't read the book yet. I have it, and it's my next book I'm reading. Okay. I can imagine that when you talk about partnerships in technology, that the Internet of Things, I would guess, is part of the third wave.
Right.
One of the thoughts that I've had a lot about the Internet of Things is that things like respirators will be connected to the Internet, your refrigerator connected to the Internet. Have you given much thought to the security implications that go along with that? Because today, if a threat actor breaches our bank account, we lose money. In 10 years, if a threat actor breaches our respirator, we could lose our lives.
Right.
Have you thought about that? Is that addressed in the book?
It is.
Just curious to get your thoughts.
No, it's the continued march of technology creates both opportunities and challenges. It creates opportunities to enable us to do a lot of different things we couldn't do before in better ways, and is, you know, leveling the playing field in terms of access to information, really democratizing access to information. That was the core idea of the internet, and now, you know, through a whole host of things, democratizing access to opportunity and entrepreneurship, so everybody has more of a shot. So there are a lot of positives, but there are also a lot of negatives. And part of the, you know, the call in the book is for there to be more discussion between the innovators and the policymakers, however frustrating that might be, for exactly the reason you mentioned, that, you know, the Internet of Things, and you mentioned some examples, but there are a number of companies, including GE, you mentioned Jeff Immelt, who's working on the industrial internet. A big priority of a big company like IBM is on this idea of smart cities. That's going to require a lot of partnership with a lot of different companies. And the potential is significant because a smarter city that can manage traffic better, something that might be of benefit to some folks living out this way, you know, as you get to Simi Valley. That's great. But how do you make sure you manage that in ways that things are, privacy is protected and systems are protected from attack? And driverless cars as well. Google and Uber and a lot of people are working on these autonomous cars. It has a lot of potential, but also, you know, some risk. And you better make sure those networks are encrypted so somebody doesn't have the ability to wreak considerable havoc. So the innovation will continue to move forward. You know, we need more of in the third wave is this dialogue on both sides to figure out how do you maximize the benefits to society, but also minimize some of the risks. That's not going to happen if the technologists are focusing on their technology and you know, not really paying attention to the broader societal impact, not really wanting to engage with government on some of these policy issues. It's going to be tough.
Other questions? Yeah, there's plenty. We'll start right here in the middle on the red.
Maybe we should let the people who promised they were AOL customers ask the questions
Yeah.
first. If you work for, you're subscribing to some competitive service,
There.
then we will ignore your question.
We'll go.
Hi. So you talked about how policy is a big thing to manage and get around. What are some other things that you've ran into and ways that you've gotten around them to help start yourself up?
It's a great question, and as I kind of said briefly at the beginning, when we started AOL 31 years ago, there were a ton of challenges. You know, people, when we kind of burst on what appeared to be bursting on the scenes in the late 1990s, when the internet went from nobody knew what it was to everybody wanted to get connected, you know, the sense was like AOL, it's like a overnight success. We actually had been at it a decade and almost went out of business a few times before we finally broke through. There are a lot of challenges, and we just kept focusing on, you know, keeping our eye on the prize, or light, you know, the light at the end of the tunnel. Somehow, some way, we're going to, you know, make this thing work. And but some of the challenges were because, you know, in retrospect, I thought it would happen faster when I was 25 and getting going, because it seemed so obvious to me. It was hard because at the time, some of you may recall, that most people didn't have personal computers. Most people who had personal computers didn't have this thing called a modem to connect it to the world. Some of you may recall you actually went to a computer store to something called the peripheral section to get a modem. Essentially saying that modem thing, that connecting thing, that's sort of optional, almost irrelevant. If few people want to go get it, that's fine, but actually that's not really what most people want on their computer. If you actually got the PC and figured out a way to get the modem built in, then you had to figure out this communication software, which was hard. It was really designed for people that were pretty sophisticated, not for everybody. If you then got through that and actually got online, there was nothing to do. There was no content. There was nobody to talk to. And oh, by the way, while you're connected back then, it was about $10 per hour to be connected. So we said, you know, these are all challenges. We just need to make it easier to use. We need to make it more useful. We need to make it more fun. We need to make it more affordable. We had big competitors, so we said we need to focus on partnerships, so we weren't going to just kind of try to compete head to head. We raised $1 million in our first round. IBM and Sears launched a competitive initiative called Prodigy and announced and spent $1 billion. So like we weren't going to win that battle. We need to figure out how to do partnerships. We need to. So it was a an iterative effort of a lot of hard work, and some things worked and some things didn't. It was 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And to be honest, there were definitely more than one occasion where I'd get a phone call from my parents that went sort of like this, which is I knew where we're going. Steve, we love you, and we're proud of you. But it doesn't seem like your online thingy is working. Do you have like a plan B? Is there something like maybe time to work for like a real company? And but we just stuck with it. And I think that's part of the reason I wrote the book is that lesson around perseverance. I think is going to be necessary for this next generation of innovators who are taking on difficult challenges that don't lend themselves to quick solutions or overnight successes.
Right here in the front, and then we'll go back there. Okay. Yeah, like that.
Thanks. Did Judge Green get the AT&T breakup right, and is there any similar logjam today?
I think he did get it right. And for those who don't know the history here, in the late 70s and early 80s, there was a big antitrust suit against AT&T, which at the time was Ma Bell and basically owned the communications world. Back then, you actually couldn't even plug a phone into the network, unless it was an AT&T authorized phone. And they owned local and they owned long distance, and it was pretty significant. And there was a debate whether it's a public utility or it should be kind of opened up to competition. Ultimately, the decision was to break it up into 7 regional phone companies. Out here it was Pacific Bell, and different parts of the country was different kinds of things. And then that went through a series of things. But more importantly, some of the rules regarding how the network was organized and what hardware could be connected to it and what services could be connected to it unleashed basically thousands of companies doing different things in communication. So it was as much of a game changer in terms of what made the internet possible as anything else, but doesn't get the same attention. In terms of what today, I don't think there's anything of quite of that magnitude that is sort of a fundamental change would really unleash that kind of ripple effect in terms of innovation. But there are a bunch of laws about specific industries that I think do need to change, and hopefully will change in the third wave. There are some regulations that I think the question on regulations are the regulations appropriate for the world in which we live and where we're going, and they actually help protect people, or are they essentially protecting the incumbents by making it harder for the disruptive insurgents to challenge the status quo? To the extent there are things, and obviously food safety and other things, there are some things that are legitimate reasons for regulation, but there are many cases where it's really more designed to lock in the status quo, which often, like at AT&T at its heyday, makes it harder for the innovators to innovate, and that ultimately is not a healthy thing in terms of innovation and economic growth, job growth, things like that.
Right down the center aisle, fellow, yes, with your hand up right there. And we have a microphone for you here.
Back on April 6th through the 8th, they had the economics conference up at the Bacara Resort and Hotel in Santa Barbara.
I know that hotel.
Yeah,
Spiffy
okay, well, a number of months ago, I asked if I might get some type of financial assistance to attend the conference, being that I'm not a millionaire and I can't pay $400 a day to stay there. And I would like to have listened to what these people had to say. And now there's another conference called Brainstorm E coming up at Carlsbad at some resort up there, and that's going to cost $400 a day. And I was bluntly told, well, this is by invitation only. So in other words, if you're not a millionaire, you're just average working guy, your schmuck, an idiot, has nothing to contribute, well, we'll let everybody else make the decisions for the rest of the people. Millionaires like yourself ought to chip in and say, you know, okay, we'll set aside several $100,000 so the average working guy might be able to attend the conference. I don't think we're all stupid people. In fact, my opinion, there's a lot of people on Wall Street who ought to have their ass in jail right now. So
is there
I
a
think, you know,
question?
and I also wrote the Gates Foundation, you know, and I said, look, you know, I'm just a school teacher. I can't really afford to, you know, pay $400 or $500 to, you know, go up there. Why don't you guys, you know, help me out? You got more money than Carter's got pills. Well, it's by invitation only.
Well, I'll
I
answer in two
resent
respects.
being treated like that.
I answer in two respects. First of all, at the Case Foundation, we're involved in a lot of events, a lot of conferences, including I talked about this Millennial event, and essentially all of them are broadcast so that anybody can access them. We do believe that that's, you know, the better way to make sure there is more inclusivity in terms of people understanding, you know, what's being discussed. And I would say some of the, you know, I don't know the specific ones you're talking about, the conferences that have gotten a lot of traction, like the TED conference. Originally, it was kind of elitist. There was a few hundred people in the room who paid, I can't remember what the amount was, and about 10 years ago, they said, we're going to take all that content, what they call TED Talks, and make it freely available. And some of those TED Talks now, tens of millions of people viewing it. So I think it's an example of how the internet, however imperfect it might be, basically it allows ideas to spread in a way that is more inclusive so more people can participate. And it's not so much what happens in terms of what only a few people are aware of. It's much more diverse.
Right here in the middle.
So here's a bit of a different question. I'm in healthcare, and I know that I cannot get through a procedure without my nurse's back turned toward the patient, quickly entering all of her data, because we're all online now with everything we do. We have to have our electronic medical record. I also know I cannot take my two kids to dinner and get through a dinner without their cell phones and their Instagram and Snapchat and Facebook open. So I'm wondering where human interaction has a role in the third wave, and will we all be just glued to our screens of various sizes, or will person-to-person interaction remain viable in the future?
It's a fair point, and yeah, I'm partially responsible for your family challenge. I'm sorry about that. With 5 kids, trust me, I understand exactly, you know, the dilemma. I would say that what's I think going to be interesting about the third wave is it's actually, you know, I talked about this earlier, it's going to not be so much about the software, but how it connects to systems and connects to people. So, for example, in the case of education, there are people that do believe, particularly in Silicon Valley, that basically we should, you know, shutter all the universities and allow everybody to just learn in what they call the cloud. And I think that's ridiculous. I think there are ways to make sure people have access, whether it be these TED Talks or Khan Academy or whatever, to information, so everybody has that information. But there's also going to be a role of like real people, whether it be teachers or doctors or what have you, and using technology to enable them to be more effective by treating everybody more as an individual, whether it be around health or around their pace of learning. Kids don't all learn at the same rate. Some are more visual learners. Some just need more time. So figuring out ways for teachers to be able to customize the learning experience, I think, is critically important. And I think on the healthcare side, my own view is electronic medical records, although burdensome to get going, are critically important to be able to track things in a way that will result in more precision medicine, will result, in my opinion, with fewer misdiagnoses. And so I think that's a healthy thing. The question is how to integrate that in ways that the benefits outweigh some of the risk. The last point I'd make is what's going to be interesting, I think, in this third wave is it's the mindset is going to be different in terms of how we even think about relating to technology. The first wave essentially was about connecting through a PC. The second wave, for the most part, was about connecting through our phones or through our tablets. The third wave will take it to the next level, where in many cases there are different devices and sensors that you're not interacting with directly, but like things like smart cities that end up being aggregated together. So you're concerned about losing a sense of humanity and personal connection in a world that seems to be becoming more technology-centric is fair. I'm just hopeful that in this third wave, this next generation of innovators will figure out ways to use this technology to do a better job of things that matter to us and also address some of the concerns you and many others have.
Right here.
Steve, you were talking about policy and innovators and policymakers needing to have more conversations. Let's take this to a global level. I mean, recently we've seen in China, for instance, that they've shut down Disney's streaming platform and iTunes. And then you look at what's going on with Google right now in Europe. How do you see us as the internet knows no boundaries, but yet governments do know boundaries and are trying to build walls?
It's tough. Part of my argument in the book is that these challenges are going to get more difficult, not less difficult. And part of it is figuring out within our country how to best navigate through these kind of challenging, kind of dynamics, some of which we've talked about, and then figuring out new ways to connect things globally and figure out new methods of trying to drive more cooperation on issues that matter. And it's exactly as you say, the borders are still important, but less important in a global digital world. And some of the institutions that exist probably need to be rethought in terms of how do they best navigate in this new world. And it's going to be tricky. And it's only going to happen if we get more of the folks who are driving some of this innovation into that discussion, as opposed to the general perception, particularly in places like Silicon Valley, which is like, oh, I have no interest in dealing with that government stuff. And I understand why. Because it is frustrating and it is burdensome and it is, kind of sometimes you just want to pull your hair out. But I think you're going to need to have more engagement on those issues. You saw this recently with the issue of Apple encryption, which got a lot of attention. How do you enable people to get the benefits of these technologies in a way that protects their privacy while also giving the government some capacity to protect the society? Tricky. It's harder than it was in in the era of the telephone a half century ago, and people say, okay, we're going to protect your privacy, but we're going to have this little thing, court order, wiretapping kind of thing. It's much more difficult in this world, and it's going to get harder still as we move into this next wave.
Back on this side here. Okay, right here. Yes.
Hi, Steve. I came all the way from Orange County to meet you. It's an honor to meet you. And I just want to tell you, I was an AOL employee, and AOL was a big part of my life. I met my husband through AOL chat room.
Hopefully you're still together.
He's still there. And I also got my job through, the chat room, too. I used to work for Digital City in Santa Monica during the AOL heydays. My question is there a fourth book in the works? Are you planning not fourth book.
Fourth wave?
No.
I'm still trying to figure out the third wave. Somebody else here has to figure out the fourth wave.
No, is there any book in the works after third wave?
This one just came out 3 weeks ago. Can I focus on this one? It took me 56 years to write one book. Maybe I'll do it. I really don't have any plans to do a second book. To me, this was, it just felt important to me to spend the time reflecting on the journey I've had and some of the lessons, including the things that didn't work, and maybe others can get some benefit from some of those lessons, and lay out the framework, which I think is going to happen in the next 10, 15, 20 years. So that really was what led me to I've been asked for probably 20 years to write books. I always resisted because I think I just naturally was more interested in what's happening next than what happened before. And it was only when I realized the third wave was going to look a little like the first wave that I said, well, interesting. Well, so therefore I can write a book that really is mostly about the future and help people navigate the future, much as Alvin Toffler helped me reading that book, The Third Wave in 1980, helped navigate the future. And some of the stories about these early days and some of the lessons learned will be, while they are historical, as Shakespeare said, sometimes the past is prologue, and actually some of those stories might help inform people thinking about the future, trying to create that future.
Right here. He's right behind. There you go.
Hi, Steve. It's an honor to talk to you. I think I speak for a lot of people to say that you really helped me discover the internet. That was the reason. It was all about AOL. And I have kind of a dumb question. You've got mail. I used to hear that sound, and no one's ever come up with anything even close to that. Who came up with that, and did you know, like, right away that was going to work as a killer thing?
It's an interesting story. So what happened there, and I actually have it's a story in the book that is kind of interesting, is we were struggling in the late 80s to figure out a way to humanize the internet so that it became less threatening and more friendly. And there were a bunch of things we were doing to try to do that. And this is the time we only probably had 30 employees in the company, and I was talking with some of our folks in the customer service area about how do we create a friendlier face and more inviting, make this seem less scary. I said, I wonder if we could add voices to the software so that when people signed on, that you say welcome. And a woman, Karen Edwards, who worked in our customer service department, heard me say that and said, well, like my husband, Elwood, does radio voiceovers. So I'll just have them, so I literally got a little Post-it note out and wrote, welcome, you've got mail, a bunch of different things. And she took it home, and the next day she brought back a little cassette tape, and we played it, and it was perfect. And so he added it to the software, and within a year, he was one of the most iconic voices in the country, and even a movie that Meg Ryan, it came out with a movie called You've Got Mail. So it was one of these kind of a little bit of accidents that it's trying to kind of like brainstorming how do we make it friendlier, overhearing the conversation. The husband happened to be the radio guy. So Elwood now is actually famous. I was doing some radio interviews, and he's now in Cleveland, and said, well, you got Elwood here. You've got mail.
We have time, I'm sorry, for just one last question. We'll go right here. Yeah, sure.
Thank you. Steve, do you think in the opt-out option will become obsolete?
Opt-out option?
Opt-out. Basically, when you go on the internet or a lot of these apps or programs or things like that, you have an opt-out option.
No, I don't think they'll be obsolete.
Do you think that's going to become obsolete, that everything has to go, eventually it's going to be online, whether it's healthcare, whether it's your finances, whether it's...
No, my view is people will have some choice, so they can opt out. But at the same time, in most situations, for most people, they will conclude the benefits of opting in, and what they can get from that will maximize the risks of opting in. And so I'll give you one example. When in the early days of what we now think of as e-commerce, at the time it was called electronic shopping, call it 25 years ago, I would go to different industry conferences where they'd be debated. And the general view was electronic commerce, e-commerce, online shopping will never happen. The reason it will never happen is most people will never trust the internet enough to type their credit card in because of fear of hackers. So where are we today? Most people are comfortable entering their credit card and then say to Amazon or somebody else, please store it for me so I don't have to enter it again. And even says, which would be completely kind of counter to people's expectations 25 years ago, please track what I am buying so you can recommend other things I might be interested in. And Netflix saying that, please track the movies I'm watching, and so you don't have to do that. But people say, I'd like to do that because actually it's more convenient to order online It's more convenient not to re-enter my credit card every time. It's actually helpful to say, if you were interested in this book and that book, maybe you'd be interested in that book. So it evolved where consumers had a choice and basically said, on balance, I think this new system makes sense. My belief is in some of these other sectors, that similar dynamic will take hold, where some people say, no, I don't want to be part of this, but people will say, no, actually, if there is better data around my health and my doctor has more insight into my health, they more likely will diagnose correctly what my problem is and more likely be able to recommend intervention, would be a drug or something that actually works for me. I'd rather have that than say, no, I don't want to be part of that system, and it'd be a little bit more guesswork.
It seems to be, though, more and more healthcare providers and financial institutions and things like that require that you do it online, is what I guess.
Right. Well, some will require, but then you have a choice of going to some place that don't. But my bet is, while people will have the choice to opt out, most people will decide to opt in because overall they'll make an assessment that the benefits of that kind of outweigh the risks.
Great. If all of you could remain in your seats while Steve can cut around the corner here to get to the desk. He needs to get there first to sign books, which we would love to have you all come by and say hi to Steve and have him sign.
Thank you very much for coming.
Yeah, thank you, Steve, so much for coming. Thanks, Steve.